Hello, everybody. You are joining me beside the fire. Badgie Beebs is sitting beside me. He's just rolled over to show me his tummy. And if you can hear the fire crackling in the background, that's exactly where I am, right in front of it. We have a bit of an ongoing discussion about the fire because the house came with an open fireplace. And initially we weren't planning on using it much because science shows that there's quite a lot of particulates given out with open fireplaces and stoves. And not only do we not want to sort of breathe in the particulates ourselves and have our doggies breathe them in, but we also don't want to be blasting particulates out into our local neighbourhood as well. Because that's often the criticism of stoves and fireplaces, is that they're predominantly in affluent areas where people don't need, in inverted commas, to have a stove or a fireplace for warmth. They do it purely for aesthetic reasons. So I think the last kind of research that I read on this was saying something like 96% of stoves and fireplaces are aesthetic rather than sort of necessity. Obviously, living up here in the Highlands, you're probably closer to people who actually genuinely do need stoves and fireplaces for necessity. You know, people in really rural areas who potentially experience sort of energy, what's the word, like blackouts and things like that during the winter months. But to be honest, I mean, we live like a mile from Inverness city centre, so we are definitely not in that category. However, it's one of these tricky ones where we're in an area where loads of local people have stoves and fireplaces. So on the one hand, you don't want it to be like a tragedy of the commons style, you know, everyone else is doing it, therefore we're also going to do it. Because obviously that's a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of air quality. But on the other hand, you also feel a bit like, well, if we cut off our nose to spite our faces, you know, we're only really denying ourselves, but overall we're probably not making that much of a difference to the local air quality if like basically every other house on our street has one. I appreciate that's not a great argument, because if everybody felt like that, you know, positive change would never happen. But we did actually we've had one blackout since we moved in, which is, to be fair, probably more related to the age of our house and the fact that our wiring needs redone and things like that than anything else. But there was an electricity blackout at the same time that we were getting our gas and electric smart meter installed. So we were without any power at all for about 2 or 3 hours. And that obviously wasn't great because we couldn't put the heating on, we couldn't get hot water, couldn't turn any of the lights on. So that was definitely a bit of a wake-up call of like, well, I guess if we had a stove at least in the front, in the living room, then in that kind of rare eventuality, we would still have the option to sort of heat the house. So we are currently thinking about getting a stove. We're in the process of potentially getting quotes. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really quite know how to square that circle of like, it's not really the right thing to do sort of from a particulates and air quality point of view. But equally, we do live in a part of the country now where blackouts are potentially more common, albeit not really that common that we couldn't cope without without a source of heat for a couple of hours. You know, we don't live so incredibly remotely that we could be cut off for days by snow, sort of thing, you know. So yeah, tricky one. But my only thought is, if we do go down this route, we'll get a stove. We currently have an open fireplace, but you can only burn coal on that, and I definitely do not like burning coal. At least with a stove you can burn wood, which is obviously a renewable resource, and the ash from wood can go on the compost bin, so we can recycle the ash rather than it going into the landfill bin. So that feels a bit better. And if we can burn wood, it means we can recycle wood from things like my DIY efforts, which segues nicely onto this week's podcast topic, which is that I just built a potting bench. So I'm very proud of this. I know I've been talking on Instagram quite a lot, and I recorded a podcast maybe last month about my compost bin, and I finally got my compost bin finished this week as well. So the last step was to build a lid, which is done and attached, and seems so far, touch wood, to be working really well. So I need to buy some linseed oil because I ran out of linseed oil to treat the lid, but the rest of it's treated. But otherwise it is fully functioning and and in working order even as we speak. So that's very satisfying to be able to be putting out compost both from our own kitchen, like veg peelings and tea leaves and stuff. I drink loose tea, so I'm hoping that's going to make some really nice compost. But also recycling things like cardboard. So at the moment I'm putting cardboard in the compost bin as well. So I'm getting my sort of roughly 1/3 greens to 2/3 browns, which is what I've sort of read and seen on YouTube is a good combo to hopefully produce some nice compost in the next sort of year or so. So yeah, it's very satisfying to be able to put sort of Amazon packaging and whatnot. What I do at the moment, actually it was, I'm not sure who it was, so I'm sorry if you're listening to this and you think that was my comment, but somebody commented a while back because I was saying I like to shred paper and shred like green waste through the garden shredder to go on the compost bin, but I was struggling with cardboard because it's too soft to go through the garden shredder but too thick to go through the paper shredder. And someone here suggested just leaving it out in the rain for a couple of days for it to get wet and soggy, and then you can just break it up with your hands really easily. And it's so true. It basically falls to pieces, which is amazing. And it also makes taking all the plastic tape off it a lot easier because it basically just falls off. You just sort of pick at the edge of it with your fingernail and then you can just whisk off like whole metre lengths of plastic tape, which is very satisfying. So that's what I've been doing. I've got a sort of semi-permanent box of cardboard sitting beside the compost bin. And then every time I put in a bunch of greens, I just shred up a bit of cardboard and mix it through. So I will definitely report back on what's going on with the compost bin. But the other project I'm very proud to say I started and finished within 2 days this week was a potting bench for my greenhouse. So greenhouse was here when we moved into the house, and was mostly full of just like rubbish. Like the previous owner of this house had clearly cared quite a lot for the garden, but was quite elderly by the time he moved. And so you could kind of tell that the garden had had a lot of love in the past, but maybe in the last few years had been somewhat neglected. And I suspect maybe they'd just got a gardening company or something in to just tidy everything up ready for sale, because the whole back garden was basically one giant veg patch. But when we came to view the house, it was just all empty. It was just like basically all bare soil. And there were some pretty well-established weeds growing through it. But then, yeah, whole swathes where it was bare. So I suspect they probably had a gardening company come in and just pull everything out. And then in the couple of weeks that they'd been showing the property, some weeds had grown back. But yeah, the greenhouse was kind of similar. Like there was an old plastic, like not picnic table, like patio table in there, but like really old, with the plastic sort of degrading, falling to pieces and all cracked. And a bunch of sort of plant pots and various like weed membrane and things like that. But everything was just quite foosty and falling to pieces. So I did a bit of a clear out maybe before Christmas, just to make space for my fig to go in, to overwinter the fig. But I basically dumped as much stuff as I could at that point, and then piled the rest of it on the other side of the greenhouse to create one empty space for my fig to go in. But I always wanted to build a potting bench or buy a potting bench, so I've been sort of looking around online and pricing them up, and it's kind of like any hobby, isn't it? You can sort of spend as much or as little money as you want. Like you can get them relatively cheap, like less than 50 quid on Facebook Marketplace, and Gumtree and things like that. But then a potting bench is quite big, so then it's got to be sort of either something you can take to pieces to fit in a regular car, or it's got to be cheap enough that if you wanted to, say, hire a van for a couple of hours, that wouldn't then swallow up all of the savings that you're making. So I kind of browsed around for a little bit, couldn't really find anything that was... I basically constantly keep an eye on Facebook Marketplace for things for the garden. I wasn't really seeing much of interest pop up. And there's also just a lot of like plastic toot on Facebook Marketplace, but in garden centres as well. So, and then obviously you see this stuff filtering down to Facebook Marketplace when people have used it and decided they don't want it. And you can kind of tell, like, for all that it's cheap, it's just going to fall to pieces almost instantly. So it's kind of not worth it. So yeah, and then I was looking on like actual garden centre websites and online nurseries and things, and proper sort of wooden potting benches are really expensive. So then I started thinking, well, maybe I could build something. problem is, wood is also very expensive. See aforementioned compost bin podcast, where I think I spent about 250 quid in total for like the wood and the screws and everything for the compost bin. And I did have screws left over and wood left over, both of which went into this potting bench project. So that obviously has reduced the cost of the compost bin a little bit. But yeah, buying wood is by no means the sort of cheap, in inverted commas, option. So for the potting bench, I was like, don't really have the spare cash to just go out and buy something new. But over the last couple of months since we moved in, there's been a lot of wood just accumulating in the garage. So there was some wood left in the garage from the previous owner, who was clearly a bit of a DIY enthusiast himself. And then there's various bits of wood that were sort of washed up in the garage from the house. So he left, when he moved out, he left quite a lot of furniture behind. And we're currently using actually a decent amount of it, but there's some that we've given to charity. And there's some that we've passed on to sort of family. And the other bits that we're using now will be kind of replacing over time. One of the bits he left behind was his bed. And it wasn't really a style that we would have wanted to use for ourselves anyway. But on top of that, I don't know, it just feels kind of weird to use someone else's bed. Is that me being kind of tragic? If it had been a style that we particularly liked, then we probably would have kept the actual bedstead and obviously just replaced the mattress. But it was quite an old-fashioned kind of style bed. And the mattress was like fine, but yeah, again, it's a bit like, not sure how I feel about sleeping on someone else's mattress if it's going to be our sort of permanent mattress, you know? So we basically replaced that instantly. We really liked our bed in our last flat, which is just IKEA, but it's a nice, smart, minimalist design, and we liked the mattress, which also came from IKEA. So we just bought the whole thing again because we sold our last bed and mattress to the people who bought our flat in Edinburgh. So yeah, we just bought the same thing again, which meant we then had this bed that we needed to dispose of. So I'm actually in retrospect thinking the mattress must have been gone already. I'm making things up. The mattress in the guest bedroom were left behind, and I'm pretty certain they're almost brand new because they look like they haven't really been slept in. But yeah, I think I'm right in saying the mattress in our room was gone. Shh, no one needs your thoughts on mattresses. I've been sitting here quite quietly. Come join me. So yeah, it was just the bedstead, and the bedstead was massive and like solid wood. So we had to sort of unbolt it all and then carry it downstairs in pieces. And then bits of it went off to the dump because they were just like metal rails and things like that. But the actual wooden bits, I was like, these are quite good solid wood, like headboard and the sort of baseboard. So I put them, unhelpful crying. So I put them in the garage, and I thought, well, at some point, hopefully I'll find a use for that because it looks like solid wood. I don't know enough about wood to know what kind of wood. It's quite a dark. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like, I don't know. I was about to say mahogany. I was like, I hope it's not mahogany because I've just made it into a potting bench. Mahogany is quite a fancy wood, isn't it? But yeah, it's quite a dark sort of solid wood. Anyway, so that's gone into it. The remaining shiplap from the compost bin has gone into it. And then, yeah, just random bits of wood that we've recovered either from doing stuff in the garden or in the house have gone into it. So I followed I can't remember how this person came across my feed. It might have been YouTube Shorts, maybe, fed me this person called Anna White, or maybe Reddit. I think actually that's it, the Reddit DIY thread that I follow. People were talking about Anna White. It's Anna with one N. I'll link her in the show notes. And she has this epic YouTube channel where she details out loads and loads of different plans of things you can make for yourself out of wood. And it's everything from make your own bed, drawers, like wardrobes, like home storage, right through to things in the garden, like planters, potting benches, actual benches to sit on, like steps with plant pots built in, that kind of stuff, coffee tables, just loads and loads of stuff. And she does free plans on her website, and to be fair, the plans are not massively detailed, which kind of makes sense because she's offering them for free, right? But it's kind of a good starting point, you know. I was about to say, sorry, I just got distracted because Badger's just crying randomly in the background again. Her blog is a classic one that I think I was talking about in my last podcast about monetizing blogs, where there is a ton of adverts. So it does make it quite difficult to follow the instructions, because it's like paragraph of instructions and a diagram, and then like 2 or 3 adverts to scroll through, and then another paragraph and a diagram, and then a video advert pops up. So I just really hate that kind of advertising. And I totally get it. She's offering all this stuff for free. You know, she's got to make her money somehow. So I'm guessing she makes a lot of money out of YouTube ads and ads on her website. But yeah, man, as a consumer, it makes it really difficult to follow that content properly. So what I did was I copied and pasted the actual diagram, where she gives like a line diagram with dimensions, into a separate Word document. And then I went through and I copied and pasted the text that would be useful to me. And then I kind of made notes on it. So I measured the width of the greenhouse door and the height of the greenhouse door, just to make sure I didn't build something that was so big I couldn't get it through the door. Spoilers, it was almost too big to get through the door. Despite having measured it, it was like just the right width, but it meant we did have to push it a little bit. And of course, we were trying to get a solid wood structure through a glass door. I was like, oh god, this is gonna end in disaster. But we got it in, so it was fine. And the length, I should have probably measured the length, but what I ultimately ended up doing was I had 4 bits of shiplap that were kind of roughly the same length as each other. I think they were about 55 inches, something like that. And they were left over from the compost bin where I needed 60-inch lengths. So the lengths of shiplap, I could get 2 60-inch lengths from one length of shiplap, and then this random 55-inch that annoyingly was like just too short to be useful for the compost bin. But then I thought, well, all of these 4 pieces are like within an inch or 2 of each other of being the same length. So I just cut them all down to the same length. And then they formed the bottom shelf and the actual work surface of the potting table. And I think they really help kind of, the fire's kicking off now. They really help just in general sort of make it look a little bit smarter and more cohesive and intentional. Because this is kind of, it's something that I've learned with knitting, that if you're knitting with thrifted yarn, it's always good to hold it double with something that's a bit more intentional and can act as like a sort of cohesive thread that runs through the whole project, literally when you're knitting, obviously, but figuratively when you're talking about wood. So, for example, I quite often knit with thrifted yarn held double with mohair, and the mohair I'll buy new, but the mohair will all be one set colour. So it just gives the whole project a sort of cohesive look that makes it look less like you've knitted it with thrifted yarn, you know. And I feel like with the potting bench, it sort of does a similar job, that the fact that the bottom shelf and the work surface are the same shiplap and clearly new and quite smart looking gives the whole project, more of a kind of cohesive feel. The legs, however, were proper Frankensteined together. So I had one piece of wood that was long enough. I think the back length is 55 inches, and then the front length was something like 36 inches. I had one 55-inch piece of wood, and then everything else was too short. So I had to use various lengths cobbled together, and then use little bits of wood to act as like struts, to kind of screw them together, if that makes sense. As a side note, one thing I see a lot of DIY people use on YouTube is a pocket jig, or a pocket hole jig, where you can hold this piece of plastic or metal up against a piece of wood, and then it's got guide holes in it, so you can drill at like set angles, so say 45 degrees or whatever. And the idea is that you can screw 2 lengths of wood together without having a screw visible on the outside, because the screw ends up getting like inset into this hole. But it also means, for example, in this project where you've got 2 lengths of wood end to end, so long as they're wide enough, thick enough, deep enough, whatever, you could probably use a pocket jig to drill the screws like 45-degree angles through the join, rather than needing like an external strut. I think that's how it works. But yeah, so at some point I'm going to buy myself a pocket jig, but for now I just use scraps of wood to act as like a splint almost. And then so I basically roughly followed Anna's design, which is where you essentially build the 2 end pieces, and then you're supposed to do like cross struts to make the sort of 3D, almost like skeleton of the bench, and then you add the shelf and the work surface last. I ended up having to do the shelf and the work surface as the second step because I was doing it by myself. I couldn't physically, and I don't have clamps or anything. Side note, something else I need to buy at some point. I had to do the 2 ends, and then I couldn't physically hold the the lengths of wood that I needed as the sort of cross struts to attach the two ends together were too long for me to hold in place and screw. You essentially needed a second person to hold the other end of the strut while I screwed it in place. And because I didn't have that, I used the shelves and the work surface to screw the two ends together, because it was easier. I could do it from above rather than from the side. It's probably hard to visualize this. Sorry, this is maybe not the best medium to describe this project. But if you are interested, there's pictures in my last blog post, or a single picture I think in my last blog post, which is notes from the week, and there's a reel on my Instagram, which is @craft&thrift. So if you do want to see it physically, I'll pop a picture in the show notes as well, obviously. But yeah, so I did the ends first, then the second step I did the shelf and the work surface, and then the third step I went back and I added all the braces and struts and things to give it the sort of sturdiness. And then in Anna's design, you're supposed to have a sort of little shelf on the top of the headboard. But actually, when I realised that the headboard from the bed fit really nicely as the sort of backing board, I ditched the shelf idea and was like, that's fine, I'll do without the shelf. I think I'd rather use the headboard, and then it's sort of a nod to the previous owner of the house, you know, especially since he was also a gardener. And then when we first moved into the house and we were sort of exploring it, we found in the log store this Germanic face. So I know it's German because on the back, I assume it's German, sorry. On the back it's got a name. I'll take a photo of the name because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's a very Germanic sounding name for this face. And he's sort of a bearded man wearing what looks almost like a wizard's hat, and he's sort of carved out of a piece of wood, and the top of his hat is still the sort of natural bark of the wood. And he was just in the log pile like somebody was going to burn him, which would have been really sad. So Andrew and I were quite taken with him. So we saved him from the log pile, and I initially had him in my garage, but I've moved him into the greenhouse now because he gives kind of Green Man vibes, although the Green Man has obviously like flowers and leaves coming out of his face rather than a hairy beard. But yeah, he definitely gives that kind of vibe. So I think he will hopefully bring good cheer, good luck to my gardening efforts. So yeah, that was a very satisfying project. I sort of finished it off with some hardware that I've sort of been stashing since Edinburgh, so kind of stuff you probably shouldn't move house with, but I did anyway. So I had an old IKEA hanging rail from our previous flat. It was going to go in the kitchen, but we ended up with one extra, so I brought that up with me, and two old hooks, old brass hooks from our old wardrobe in our Edinburgh flat, and then a selection of kind of silver, almost like school cloakroom style hooks that were in our utility cupboard in the Edinburgh flat until I did a bit of a revamp, a refresh of that cupboard before we moved house, and we put in some smarter hooks. So I kept the silver ones, and yeah, they're perfect for the potting bench because it means I can hang up like hand tools, like trowels and forks, like little handheld ones, and hoping I need to get some kind of hanging hook for my secateurs and things like that. So yeah, so I think all the hardware will also just add to the sort of storage options. And then once I finished it, I had quite a pleasant hour sort of pottering on. I had the tail end of a bag of compost that I'd found in the greenhouse, so I used that to pot up some supermarket herbs. So I've got a thyme and a parsley that I bought from the supermarket that I've taken to pieces and sort of separated out the individual plants. I'm hoping some of them will survive. And I've got some rosemary cuttings I'm trying to bring on, and some mint, and some heathers, which actually don't need to live in the greenhouse. I just haven't got around to planting them out yet. Bought them in the Dobby's closing down sale, and still haven't got around to planting them out. So maybe that's a job for tomorrow. But yeah, that is my potting bench story. So thank you very much for listening, and as ever, I would love your comments or feedback. I always love engaging with you all in DMs or in the comments. If you have a sort of thrifty, gardening, crafting, like-minded friend that you think might enjoy my content, then I would love it if you could share. And otherwise, I will speak to you next week. Bye.